have a few more examples of CSS layouts that we're going to cover today. They're among the newer sort of layouts, and they include Flexbox and grid layouts in CSS. We've shown how to do some of these things using float or absolute positioning or relative positioning, but since grids are so common in any kind of graphic design, including web design, it was good when features were introduced into CSS to allow the easy creation of grids. And CSS grids and Flexbox allow us to make very flexible grids within our CSS. We're also, depending on time, going to look at a bit about mobile web development, including media queries and responsive web development. So we'll see how that goes. If some of this bleeds into next week, that's okay. All right. First thing I want to show you is a very useful tool called Can I Use? Now, it's not so much now, but back when I first introduced these into my class, not all browsers supported CSS Flexbox or grids. What this Can I Use tool does is allows you to put in a feature in CSS, and it will show you whether or not a browser implements it. And if you notice, CSS Grid and Flexbox are the two most searched features. So let's search for CSS Grid. And if we look here, this shows us statistics, and it shows us what browsers support and do not support it. So Chrome versions up through 56 did not support grid layout. Safari up to version 10 do not support it, and so on down the list. Taken in percentages, which this is an estimate, but in percentages of all users, approximately 96.31% of users use this. So this is a valid way of deciding whether you want to do something. 96% is a pretty high number of users. So it's probably safe to use CSS grid layout most of the time. You might want to get an older version of the browser to test it out. This also allows you to test on an older browser. So I'm going to go test on a version, and I can launch this browser. Oh, it's making me sign up. But apparently you can test on a actual version of the browser. But this is a very useful tool that can be used to determine whether or not a feature is available in a particular language. In larger organizations, you may have a test environment that involves having multiple versions of multiple browsers and multiple platforms. So, for example, test things on a Mac and on a PC, test things using the Safari browser and the Opera browser, and so on. All right. But this is a very useful tool to see if you can use something. Use a particular feature of CSS. The thing to look for is the percentages. Now here's one, media queries range syntax. Only 70% of users worldwide. Now that's a substantial amount of people cannot support this particular thing, the range queries in media queries. We'll look at media queries either this week or next week, but this shows you a form of the media query that is only acceptable on 70% of the browsers. So what you would want to do is you would want to test it on these browsers where it's not supported and see how it works. And it might work okay. I mean, work is the wrong word. It might fail and still be a readable web page, or it might totally mess up the web page. So you would want to verify that before you would use it, I would suggest. All right. First thing we're going to look at is the grid layout. And I have some resources that you should view. I posted some of them last week. Well, I posted, yeah, grid and Flexbox layout, and you should review these. And I posted more of these this week. So please take the time. Remember, there's one lecture per week, and there is the expectation that you will be online, checking out some of these online resources also, as this is a blended class. So please take a look at these CSS grid layout resources, as well as the CSS Flex one. Let me show you the example I came up with for CSS grid layout. Okay, Paige, I'm not sure what that request means. Paige Johnson's requesting to annotate the shared content. During annotation, you cannot control the shared content unless you stop annotating. I'm going to click approve and see what that does. Oh, this allows me to go in and, right. Oh, and Paige has left the room. Okay, and Paige is back. All right. How do I get out of this? That shows you what happens if you click on something and you don't understand what it does. Should always probably do some research. Okay, there, we're out of it. Whew. I thought the rest of the class was going to be me drawing things on my screen. All right, anyhow, here's a grid example. And I have this example where it's a page about Star Wars. And notice that as I make the container bigger or smaller, these columns get bigger and smaller. Now, if we look at the code that does this, let's first look at the HTML. Notice we have our standard tags, a link to a style sheet. We have a div that serves as a wrapper. That goes around everything. That is useful when we have a grid view, to have one div that goes around all our content. And we call it a wrapper because it wraps everything up in one nice little package. Other than that, though, it's sort of the standard stuff that we've done before, where I have a header tag for the header information, a nav, a section, and a bunch of sections, and then finally a footer. If we look at the CSS, and I think I have a second version of it here. We'll look at the second version in a minute here. Let's look at the first version. All right, notice what we have. We said we have a wrapper, and the display type is grid. All right, that means all of the block tags inside the wrapper are going to be treated as grid items. All right, it's going to be treated as part of a grid. So what does that mean? That means that all these things, header, the nav, the sections, and the footer, are going to be boxes in a grid. What do I mean by a grid? I mean something like this, where there's columns and rows. Now these boxes are really small in this grid. You know, think of it like graph paper, but in our CSS examples, the boxes are going to be bigger. You might have a grid element that contains only, you know, that you might have something like this where there's only 3 grid columns. But think of it as being like a giant Excel worksheet where you have rows and columns that we're going to put stuff in. So we're saying everything inside this wrapper is a grid. We're saying there's 10 pixels between each grid item. So notice there's 10 pixels here, 10 pixels here, and so on. Grid template columns are 20%, 30%, and 30%. So if we look at this, notice that 20%, 30%, 30%. Now you might notice that, well, that header doesn't cover only 20%. You know, shouldn't the header just be this little box if it's part of the grid? No, because we are able to override those template columns. So those grid template columns apply if we don't specify anything about the starting and ending column or row. In this case, there's 3 template columns. And we say that the header starts in column 1 and goes up to column 4. That's a little confusing to me. I would think 3 would be better, but that's not how they wrote the language. They wrote the language, if you want it to be the first 3 columns, that it goes from 1 through 4, not 1 through 3. So that's going to take up these 3 columns in the grid. We've basically specified that we have a 3-column grid. I was going to draw this in paint. We have a grid with 3 columns and a certain number of rows. We've said this header takes up from 1st to the 4th. That means the first 3. So the header takes up these 3 columns, which, if you notice the screen, is exactly what we have. We look at the navigation. We say grid start 2 and end at 5. So this takes up the next, one more. Navigation is only 1 column wide, but it takes up 3 rows. Which, if you notice in this layout, it takes up 3 rows. These other sections, we have not specified any kind of column or rows for, so they each take up exactly 1 column and 1 row. So this will be section 1, section 2, section 3, 4, 5, and 6. Finally, we say the footer starts at row 5 and covers columns 1 through 4. So this is the footer. So we're able to position things inside that grid, and we're able to make things go across multiple rows and multiple columns. We've specified a minimum width of this wrapper at 600 pixels, which means that we can get it this big. As we make it smaller, it gets to a certain size, it doesn't get any smaller. Other things in the CSS, we've set the opacity of these things. 0.9, which means that it's 90% solid, but it's 10% see-through. So we can see the little little bit of the graphic underneath it. And we've done that to all of the different pieces of the page. If I didn't have any of these things on here, let me go in and quickly get rid of this and get rid of this and get rid of this. I don't have a starting and ending column or anything. What that's going to do then is that is going to put everything in just one column and row. So if we don't have any of those things on here, by default, we have 3 columns, but we're going to have the header in this one, the nav in this one, section 1, section 2, section 3, section 4, section 5, section 6, and the footer over here. Not a particularly good design, but I did want to demonstrate what it would look like if we didn't have any of those starting rows and starting columns. That's pretty much what I specified. I'm off a little bit. I think I specified that there were 6 columns where 6 sections where there's only 5 sections. Again, by adding these things back in, I undo the footer, save it. Now it's in that, and it takes across all 4 columns. I undo the row start and undo the column start. So the column start and the row start allow these grid items to go across more than one column. That's it in a nutshell with grids. There's more that you can do, and please investigate the resources I provided to get a bit more information about more stuff that you can do with the grid layout. Let's look at grid layout version 2. We've done the style sheet to look like this. This is very close to what I've done with the floating example. If you remember, our last floating example looked almost exactly like this. Well, look how simple the code is, the CSS code. We're not floating things to the left and doing all these things like this. We simply have our wrapper, which we define as being a grid. Our template columns are 20 and 70, which means that if we were to look at this, we have 2 columns. The first one takes up 20% of the screen, and the second one takes up 70%. The header takes up 1 through 3. That means the first 2 columns. Header takes up the first 2 columns. The nav, we don't specify anything about the nav, which means it takes up 1 row and 1 column. Section, we don't specify anything, so it takes up 1 row and 1 column. And the footer we specify takes up 2 columns. I hate to sound like an old timer here, but this is a very simple way to implement a very simple grid like this. This is sort of a standard design of a web page. Header on the top, nav on the side, content area, footer. If you look, a lot of simple sort of sites have this kind of layout. And this is easily implemented through the grid method of doing the CSS. I suggest you try this out. This would probably be a good layout for your project, of which the design is coming due very quickly. I don't remember the exact date on the design being due, but let's look it up. Design is due October 26th. That is not this week, but the following week, the following Wednesday. So this should be something for you to be working on. And remember, your design is going to contain a Word document with the 4 different sections that we mentioned when we talked about the project, along with a prototype, which is sort of a model or a rough draft of the pages in your project. If you have any questions about your project, please ask me. All right, we're now going to look at the Flexbox. All right, here is a Flexbox that does something pretty similar to Flow. And notice that it is responsive. By responsive, I mean that at a certain size, it's going to fit 2 columns side by side. If it gets smaller than that, it's going to go and make 1 column. So how do we accomplish that? Let's look at our HTML again. Just like before, we have a wrapper. Other than that, sort of the standard that we've been doing all semester long. What's the CSS look like then? We define the wrapper is a display type of flex. Flex wrap equals wrap. We then specify columns with their widths. And if their width, and this is just like putting a bunch of floats on things. So a width of 100% means it's going to cover the entire screen. A width of 40% is going to, and a minimum width of 300 pixels mean it's going to put things side by side if it can. Otherwise, it's going to wrap them around to a new row. If I change this to 30%, for example, save it. I swear I changed that to 30%. Losing it. Change that to 30%. It'll actually put 3 things side by side of the section. When it gets too small, it'll put them 2. When it gets too small, it will put them 1 column. How do we do this again? We simply specify that this is a Flexbox, and we specify a width for each of the elements of the page. This might be something also you'd want to try in your project. If I could make a suggestion, I would either use Flexbox or Grid on your project. All right, because those are the more sort of modern way of doing things. And they allow for very flexible and what are called responsive websites. Because if you notice, the site responds to the width of the screen. All right. Last thing we're going to look at today is developing with mobile devices in mind. So far, most of the focus of this class has been developing web pages with the thought that the web page would be viewed on a computer. All right. And that's increasingly becoming less common. Many people visit websites using their mobile device as opposed to their computer. Myself, I would say, is probably 50-50. And it sort of depends what I'm doing. If I really want to dig down onto a topic and spend some time researching it, I would probably use my laptop to look it up. If, however, I was just looking for a bit of information, like, for example, last Saturday, I was looking for a restaurant to eat at. And I just want to make sure they were open and find what their location was and just get some very basic information. I would use my mobile device for that. So people use both computers and mobile devices to access their phone or to access websites, and they might have slightly different goals when they access via their laptop versus their laptop or computer versus a mobile device. This brings about the introduction of what is called responsive web design. I think we looked at it last time, but it'd be a good time to review what we mean by responsive web design. Approach that suggests design and development should respond to the user's behavior and environment based on screen size, platform, and orientation of the screen. Flexible grids, images, and media queries are the three main principles of responsive design. And this goes on in more detail about exactly what that means. All right. Flexible grids. First of all, we'll be using, with responsive design, we'll be using percentages and not number of pixels. The one exception to that is it's okay to say minimum width and assign that a pixel amount. But generally, we're going to specify percentages. And we did that both with Flexbox and Grid. And we could also do that when we use the flow. We can actually use that when we do any of the design that we've done in class. So we're going to be using, always for the width, we're going to be using percentages and not pixels. With the one exception being it's okay to specify a minimum width in pixels. Second thing is flexible images. How do we do that? Well, we specify the width of the image and we give it a maximum width of, and we can give it not as a number, but as a percentage. What that does is it shows you here, let me try to zoom in. Notice as the screen gets bigger, the image gets bigger or smaller to accommodate that. So in both these cases, the image takes up 100% of the screen width, regardless of how wide the screen is. There's some more information on that. Here's an example showing use of percentages. Widths, as we said. And the last principle is media queries. What media queries allow you to do is to specify that you have two different style sheets. One that applies in a mobile environment, and then one that gets added on to the mobile for a desktop or laptop computer environment. Here's an example of that. And this example is posted. I have two different versions of these, and we'll talk about that at the very end of class. Here's our web page. Should look familiar. It's responsive. Notice as the screen gets narrower, the columns get smaller. Notice the image gets smaller. So the image is using a width based on a percentage. Finally, something magical happens. Well, not really magical, but pretty cool. Once we get to a certain size, the look of the page totally changes. And we go to a we go from a multi-column layout to a single column layout. Notice a bunch of things change. We get rid of the background image. The navigation looks a little bit different. Notice that we have a section. Here's another section and another one desktop only that actually completely disappears in the mobile version. All right. All these things happen because we're using style sheets that contain media queries. As a general rule, you want your mobile website to look simpler than the desktop website. What do I mean by simpler? I mean things are going to be bigger probably. All right. If you have really tiny links on your desktop site, you want to make sure the links are big enough so users can press them with their fingers. You want to make sure that there's enough space between things so that users, when they go to click one thing, don't accidentally click something else. We want it not to be multi-column, but single column. We probably want to get rid of background images because that can sort of clutter things on a mobile device. So as a rule, because of the nature of a mobile device, people interact with it differently. And we're going to make the website design simpler in a mobile as compared to a desktop. So how do we do this? Let's look at the HTML again, which should look familiar, except for one bit. We again have our wrapper. We have a header, a nav, a section, another section, another section. These two are desktop only. Notice they have a class of desktop only. All right. Notice we have two style sheets. All right. When you have two style sheets, which one applies? And the answer is maybe both of them do. All right. What do I mean by maybe? The second style sheet applies based on this media query. And this says, this style sheet only applies when I'm dealing with a computer screen, not a mobile screen, and the minimum width is at least 800 pixels. So in other words, when the screen width is 800 pixels or greater, and we're on a computer screen, you get this layout. Applies to. This CSS file applies to. So everyone gets this first style sheet. The second style sheet only applies to a computer screen that is 800 pixels or bigger. All right. Now, what happens if we have the same thing in both style sheets? Which one overrules? The second one overrules the first one. So we'll see an example here. We'll see a couple examples. We'll look at both these style sheets and we'll see how it looks when we're only this style sheet applies, and then how it looks when both style sheets apply. So notice, in the main style sheet, I specify the body has a yellow background, and the fonts are Helvetica, Arial, and sans serif. That's what we get if only the first style sheet applies. That is, if the screen is not at least 800 pixels, or we're on a mobile device. If we are on a screen that's bigger than 800 pixels, then both style sheets apply, and the second one overrules with a background image, and it changes the background, and it changes the color of the text as well. That's why here, only the first style sheet applies, so we get a yellow background. Here, both style sheets apply, so the second one overrules the first. And we'll see that throughout this. Here I have the header set to 90%. Navigation set to 90%. Section image with 100%, maximum width auto. Section H1, and so on. All these things are what are used when only the first style sheet applies. So we're on a mobile device or the screen width is not 800 pixels. Notice this. Desktop only display is none. What does that mean? That means that if we are viewing on a mobile device and only this style sheet applies, everything with a class of desktop only, the display is none. So these two things have a display of none, which means that they are invisible. We don't see them. So this div, or this section and this section, disappear. We only have the one section there. However, in the case of the screen being bigger, both style sheets apply and we overrule a bunch of stuff. We specify a wrapper and the display type of grid. We specify the header column covering the first three columns, the section covering one column, the nav covering one column but multiple rows, the footer containing multiple columns, and then finally, we say for desktop only, make the display of the things with the class of desktop only make the display block. So that makes them visible on a screen that's over 800 pixels. So remember, 2 style sheets. The second one has a media query. The first one specifies rules that every page gets. So every page gets this one, gets this style sheet. Only pages that match this criteria get the second style sheet. And that second style sheet is going to overrule things in the first style sheet. So we end up with first style sheet only, both style sheets. We can change the layout, we can change colors, we can change images, we can even get rid of content. All of these things match our goals because we want our mobile page to be simpler than a desktop page. So it might be some content that's on the mobile page we want to get rid of, or some content that's on the desktop version we might want to get rid of on the mobile version. So we can do it that way. Now, how can I test on mobile devices? You can actually hook up your phone to it, all right? This is useful too if you put it on a web server, you can access it via your phone. The other thing you can do is if you use Google Chrome, you can go to More Tools, Developer Tools, and click this little icon that emulates different, like that's an iPhone SE. This is an iPhone 12 Pro. This is the Samsung Galaxy S20. So we get a rough idea of how this looks on different devices. On a Surface Pro, it looks like this. On an iPad Air, it looks like this. So we can test and make sure that the page looks the way that we want it to without having to buy one of each device. Now, this emulator is not perfect, all right? But it does give a good idea of what this would look like on multiple devices. One nice little tool, by the way, is if you hover, in developers tools, if you click on an area, select an area, oh, I don't think I can do this. Something wrong. Never mind. You can get information about what styles are applied here. Now, this particular technique is called the mobile first technique. All right. It's mobile first because our style sheet that gets applied on every machine, on every device, is the mobile style sheet. And then we add things that overrule it for a desktop. Mobile first is the approach that you ought to take when you're starting something from scratch. If, however, you were working at a company and they already have a website and they just want to make it more mobile compatible, you'd do what's called the desktop first approach. And what you would do is you would do the opposite of that, and you'd write your main style sheet I only have one style sheet in this example. I'll show you how I accomplish that. I have my main style sheet. I can actually add inside the style sheet a media query. So I can do this. And I can say this only applies if the screen is, if it's only on a computer screen and the minimum width is 800 pixels. Actually, my mistake. Both of these use the mobile first approach. In other words, we only add things for the desktop version. And that's in general the way that you want to go when you're developing a new site, is you want to get the mobile version of it working first, and then you're going to add features. And you can put those features in a new style sheet and use a media query, or you can incorporate those features right in the basic, style sheet. So in this example, everything between here and here is only for when you're on a computer screen and the width is 800 pixels. So my mistake from before, this also is mobile first, because this applies to everyone. This only applies for computer screens that are 800 pixels and wider. Everything from there to there. It's important, by the way, that you organize your code correctly so that we can easily see that this belongs to that. And that all our things match up. Because a common mistake when you do this is if I missed a curly bracket, notice it's giving me an error because I'm missing a curly bracket. I add it back in, then everything's okay. That's a nice feature of Visual Studio Code as opposed to Notepad or even Notepad++. So for your assignment that is due next week, or when is this? Let me verify. That assignment is done, due. I think it's a big week next week. We have 2 things due, I think. Yeah, due next week is homework 8, which is to develop a page about good design for mobile web development and a page about web accessibility guidelines. For these, use a media query. As well as responsive techniques that we've covered. Doing mobile first, another word for doing mobile first is called progressive enhancement, because we start with a basic page and we enhance it to cover a more elaborate setup, a desktop computer versus a mobile device. You can actually do this on more than just 2 levels. You could develop a desktop, you can develop a mobile version for the very most elementary phone, a flip phone. You could then develop a version for a smartphone. You could develop a version for a tablet, and then develop a style sheet for a desktop device. So you could take this more than 2 levels just by altering your media queries. Each one, though, enhances the very basic root style sheet that everyone gets. Are there any questions? All right, that's all I had for today. Please, if you're running into any difficulties, let me know. We will talk to you next week.